Welcome to Corrections Unfiltered, the podcast where corrections meets conversation. I'm your host, Pete Bloodworth. Today, myself and a team of corrections professionals are going to discuss some real-world challenges and strategies of prison management. We're going to talk about staff safety issues. We're going to talk about headlines that are shaping the justice system and also the perception the public has of our profession. So let's get this conversation started about this forgotten occupation. Hey, everybody, I'm Pete Bloodworth, and this is our episode 1 of Corrections Unfiltered. And I was very fortunate to be able to gather a group of corrections professionals that I've known throughout my time in corrections. And I got about 34, 35 years in corrections. I started out in the system in Phoenix, Arizona, moved around the country, retired from that system about 2014. After that, I joined on to the private prison system where I've been able to work. I was assigned to 5 different facilities, either as assistant warden or warden. Started out as a correctional officer in the other agency. And then through that period of time, I was had opportunity to work with different contracts with different state agencies or federal agencies. So I had a chance to kind of expand my knowledge base a little bit beyond than the agency that I worked for at before. So today I have a group of very, very great professionals. What I'd like for them to do is just kind of what I did, just to give you a rundown real quick about their careers so you can kind of know where they're coming from. And then we're going to pick a subject that we would like to talk about, and we'll dig in from there. So Rick, why don't you start us all out?
Sure. My name's Rick Harns. Worked for the Federal Bureau of Prisons for 24 years. Started in 1989 at Lompoc, California. Worked my way up and around all across the country, back and forth, and ended my career at the regional office in Philadelphia. So I was part of the problem rather than the solution, but it was a good gig, and I got to see the other side of things where policies are made and convoluted and all that stuff. So ran into some good people, Pete Bloodworth being one of them, and Chris McConnell being the other. So it was a good run. I'm still very passionate about corrections, even though I don't have any part of it anymore.
All right, thanks, Rick. Chris?
Hello. By way of introduction, my name is Chris McConnell, and I started my career in 1993 as a correctional officer as well with the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I stayed with the agency for about 30 years, and I was fortunate enough to work my way through the ranks and retire as a complex warden. Somewhat like Rick, really don't have much to do with corrections anymore. I've kind of got out of the business, but I'm still passionate about it and thinking of ways that I can help some of the younger staff and some of the issues that corrections is having as a whole. So that's why I'm here today.
Hey, great. Thanks, Chris. Nick, what you got?
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick Nickerson. I've got 40 years of correctional experience. I started in Arizona Department of Corrections in 1985, Arizona State Prison Complex, Douglas. I did that for 6 years, and then I switched over to the BOP in 1991 at FCI Phoenix. And then from there, several institutions, Greenville, Illinois, and then I wound up eventually at Allenwood, Pennsylvania, FCC Allenwood. I stayed at Allenwood until 2020 when I retired with 29 years in the Bureau of Prisons. Now I presently work for a contract company, Geo Group, with a contract with ICE. I presently have the largest transportation contract in the country with ICE. I cover pretty much a lot of the Northeast. I cover all of the state of Pennsylvania with multiple hub offices and a lot of different staffs. So, BOP was my primary, but now I've transitioned over to the ICE side of the things. That's it.
How about you there, Charlie?
Charlie Bueno. Got into the corrections field later in life. My career was through Northeastern Ohio Correctional Facility. Got to a rank of senior correctional officer and correctional counselor. Got to travel to and from a lot of our facilities for different reasons. Met a lot of great people, and I am also very passionate about corrections. And that's why I got involved in this podcast with these gentlemen. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Charlie. One of the subjects that we were talking about, and it's really going to be, I think, a pretty emotional conversation, was one of the articles that I found was the third corrections officer pleads guilty in an inmate's death at a New York prison. and I'll drop a link into the conversation. I'm also going to have a picture of what this article is, but let me just give you some of the information on there. It says that a third New York State Corrections officer is pleaded guilty in connection with the fatal beating of an inmate earlier this year at the Central New York prison. The corrections officer, Nicholas Vital, I think that's his name, pleaded guilty Tuesday to attempted first-degree offering a false instrument for filing, a misdemeanor. Vital was one of 10 correctional officers indicted in the March death of an inmate named Nontweet. I believe that's how you pronounce it. He originally faced the 2 felony charges: fifth-degree conspiracy and first-degree offering a false instrument for filing. The article goes on for a conversation. It talks about how the staff members beat this inmate for a period of 45 minutes using batons, boots, fists, a variety of different other implements that they use in order to beat this individual. Then and the article continues and says that this is not the first time there's been a killing in this system. In fact, when I was reaching out to this group of people and I was talking with Chris, you had already been onto something as far as this type of behavior from staff towards inmates in New York. You want to go ahead and talk about that experience?
Yeah, sure. Actually, I was sitting at the desk I'm sitting right now, and my wife came in here and she said, "Hey, Chris, did you see this video of these correctional officers beating up an inmate?" And I'm like, "No," but in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, okay, this is probably a calculated use of force. She doesn't understand our protocols. She's probably thinking that we're, beating up the inmate, whatever the case may be, but it's a very controlled movement. And she hits play, and I look at the video, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, I couldn't even watch the whole video." I remember saying to myself, "Where's the duty to intervene? Where's the supervisor at? Where's the duty to intervene?" And it inspired me to write an article. I did write an article called "Duty to Intervene," and it's going to be published in the National Tactical Officers Association magazine called The Tactical Edge. And I just talked about it. I just kind of asked why is this happening? And one thing I want to say is, things like this happen. Don't take the path of least resistance and say, this is a culture problem. That's a cop out. It's not a culture problem. It's a training problem, and it's a leadership problem, because we're all leaders on this forum today. If any one of us saw what was going on, we would have stopped it. All it takes is that one person to say, "Hey, stop. What's going on?" Or, "Hey, maybe leave the room. You're charged up." Okay. Yes, staff get charged up over a variety of incidents, but it's up to us to take that responsibility, that honorable responsibility, and just keep everything on the level. I always say a duty to intervene, it's not optional. It's something that we have to do. It's not only a professional responsibility to intervene, it's a basic human responsibility. And why it didn't happen at that facility, why, these are 2 separate incidents now, why 2 inmates are dead, why it was recorded, why there was a variety of staff with different backgrounds and different levels of responsibility that just sat there and watched it and didn't do anything, is beyond me. Something that should not happen, something we shouldn't be talking about today, but I fear if we don't, it will happen again.
Rick, you had some comments before we actually started the call. You want to jump in here and talk about your perceptions on this?
Yeah. You look at you watch the video, you read the article, then you watch the video. I could run with this all day long. It is. I disagree with you just a little bit, Chris. I think there is some cultural things going on there, but when you look at I looked at the whole New York prison system, staffing issues, not the union side of it, because the union was always going to say that they could have 200% staffing and they still would complain they don't have enough staff. But you touched on it, in that the leadership, the training, the training isn't there, the leadership isn't there. Clearly the equipment's there, but the supervision from the top down, and I'm not talking just the supervisor of the facility, whether you want to call him a warden or superintendent, the leader of the corrections department, the governor's office, everybody that's setting the tone for this system is to blame for this going on. And I go back to when I started as a CO. Lompoc was a pretty wild place, but we had a great warden, great captain, and about 50% of the lieutenants were worth a darn. Warden left, new warden came in, new exec staff came in, complete shift. They were 180s. They were terrible leaders. To put it bluntly, they felt like it was okay for staff to get covered in urine and feces every day, and nothing happened to the inmate population. There was no guardrails up. There was no not retribution, but there was nothing, no controls in place. There was nothing to say, hey, this is not what you do. And it puts staff in kind of where you feel like from the COs on up, you're kind of looking out for each other. And when you don't have the lieutenants, the second line of leadership to help you out, you're really kind of on your own. I'm not saying that's what's going on. It's certainly, there's nothing that would make this okay, what they did at this facility with the inmate we saw on the video or the one previous to that. But when you have a failure to provide any leadership, guidance, training, anything at any level, this is what you get. And what I was saying to Pete before we got on here was this just didn't happen overnight. This has been going on for years. And I don't think it's the culture, but I think it does touch on a little bit. You look at that area, that Marcy, there's several prisons in that area within 20 miles, and they're pretty small population. That part of the country is pretty pocketed. So you do, it's like that. I don't remember the name of it, but the joint there in New York where the gal fell in love with the inmate. She perpetuated their sleep. It is, they're in their own little world, so to speak, And if there's nobody coming in there bringing fresh ideas and fluffing things up and adding some new oxygen to the room, you get caught up in these bad habits, and the bad habits grow. So there's a lot of things going on with that. I feel bad that you have a governor and an attorney general, kind of painting a bad picture over this when they should be looking at themselves too and where they're culpable in this.
Definitely starts from the top. I mean,
I'm off my soapbox.
That's one of the things that as you spend more time in the system and being involved at different facilities levels and stuff, you start realizing it really truly does start from the top. If the top is not going to hold people accountable, then the bad habits spread like a virus. Nick, I know your history, quite a bit of your history. We worked around each other a few times throughout our careers, and you had to transition from the guy that they always called to be the number one guy on the extraction team, or when the body alarm or whenever the alarm went off, you were the guy who's probably going to get there first because that's the way you are. But then you had to transition from that to being the leader, and I think that's a hard transition because, like Rick and Chris have already said, now you're the person who has to make sure everything's going the way it's supposed to go, and identifying people who might be getting too hot-headed. You got any comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, as far as that transition goes, even as a leader, one of my biggest things is I lead by example, because back in the day, as you remember, I was always called on because I was bigger. I was the number one, and I had a tactical background, so I was called upon, you know what I mean? And, besides being a Christian, I always want to do the right thing. So as far as, what we're talking about here, I would never be involved in something like that. So I led by example. But even to this day, when something goes down, it seems like everybody's looking to me to still be involved. Even at 62 years old, they still want me to get involved. But from what I see from what happened there, there were some bad habits there, and they just escalated. It escalated. They didn't have proper protocols in place. They didn't have checks and balances in place, and that's how they got to where they are. And then, like Rick said, it starts at the top. This one started at the top.
Charlie and Chris mentioned this. He talked about, and Rick mentioned it too, talking about a number of years being in, but you're not involved anymore, or you might be away from the actual doing the actual duties right now, but you did them for 30 years.
Yeah.
But I think if we really go back and we look, you'll see that the conversations we have about doing the right thing, the policies and procedures, they're all cliched, and cliches are cliches because they last forever. They're proven. So, what are some of the cliches, or what are some of the different things that you can recall? Because you're a guy who's dealt with a lot of very disruptive people in very disruptive situations. You had a certain tenacity for how you handled them that always came out where respect was there. So, what were some of the things that you utilized for you to make those decisions on? Not only how far do you go, but how are you monitoring the other people around you to make sure they don't go too far?
Well, the thing is, like you said, through the years of dealing with different type of people, different personalities and stuff, you learn to adapt. And then one thing that really worked with me a lot was, as I got older, I started to become more patient. And I realized if I was more patient and I was more peaceful, I tend to be more respectful. And then you get what you give. To earn respect, you have to give respect. So that worked a lot to my advantage. Not just the fact that I was big, that also worked to my advantage, because sometimes I could utilize intimidation factor to get the point across as to what I want, or to emphasize the fact, look, I'm going to bring it. You know me, you see me, I'm going to bring it. But here's the deal. We don't have to go down this road. We can come to some kind of agreement, or we can work things out. We can be respectful to each other. You know what I mean? And that seemed to work as later in life, as I went through these transitions with some of these people. And I've got, you know the deal. I've got some stories. We all do. We've been there. We dealt with some pretty rough characters day in and day out. And it seemed as though as you got older, it was easier to talk your way through a situation than it was to fight your way through a situation.
What about you, Charlie?
I'm sitting here listening because I'm comparing myself years wise in the field to what you have. And it's amazing how fast that mindset takes over, where when the first few years you're there, you want to bust right in there and you want to take charge of the situation, settle everything down. You might have to, go hands on, or you may have to, use some chemical spray. And after a while, you just sit back and you hit it. You come into a situation and you're like, wow, I could de-escalate this by just mere presence. And the way I talk, and just the way I handle the situation with my mind, I don't have to use the physical aspect of it. And I learned that quick. I learned that quick. But you're exactly right. And Pete and I have had this discussion. I set the precedence when I first went into those pods, and I was honest, fair, but consistent, and that really does work. So in the ultimate end, that going in there and being the rough and tumble, bringing the boys in with you to take care of business, a lot of times you don't have to do that. You just, you use what you've learned to talk down, and that de-escalation is amazing if you know how to use it.
So Chris, I'm sorry, Charlie.
No,
Chris. So you've been that facility leader, multiple facility leader. You step into that environment. How do you begin changing that culture?
Well, since Rick pointed me out here about the culture, what I really meant to say on that is, if you have effective leadership and training, that'll dilute the culture. So you say, what do? I've worked at, and I think we all have, I worked at a couple of facilities that were, I'd like to say, heavy-handed or hands-on. Some of these remote facilities, they just have a tendency to kind of lean that way, and I've worked them. And so what do you do? How do you change that? Well, again, leadership and training. One thing I didn't like about my agency, it's a policy-driven agency. The Federal Bureau of Prisons has a policy on everything. I mean, they have a policy on how to work a microwave. But what I will say is, one of the best policies the agency has is our use of force policy. It is an outstanding policy. And I tell the guys all the time, look, all we have to do is follow our own use of force policy, and we'll accomplish whatever we want to accomplish. Just do it by the book. Do it by the book. If they act up, we got to put them in chains. We got to put them in chains. It's okay, but we're going to do it by policy. If we have to use munitions on them, that's okay, but we're going to do it by policy. If I have to pin them down to a bed, that is okay. but we're going to do it with policy. And I think that's, once you do that a few times and they say, hey, the result's kind of the same. I don't have to put myself out there and put hands on an inmate. Because the bottom line is we're protecting the staff so they're not prosecuted or charged or sued or whatever. That's all we're doing. So I think once you sell that message and show we can accomplish what we need to do just by following policy, I think that's the start for, the leadership and the training that starts to sway that culture.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I was never a warden, but you see, when you're at institutions and you see executive staff come in, whether it be an AW breezing through or a new warden, the whole tone of the institution can change dramatically in that inmates are inmates. They've kind of reminded me of high school kids, they can find the weak teacher, they can find the weak principal. They go, if the executive staff are actually showing up for mainline or they're actually walking the yard, which became more and more rare as time went on, inmates could find the weak one and tell them tales of woe and paint them a picture of how the atrocities that COs are perpetrating that they're just following policy, and things can start to fall apart under those, but. It could, oh God, I'm sorry, my wife calling here. You look at these situations, the situation in New York, and it seems like it's just, man, I don't even know how you're going to get that together. It's like you almost feel like they need to just empty all the prisons out and start from scratch because it's clearly gone so far off the rails that it all goes back to training and the tone and the hands-on supervision. And we managed to do, I think we all did well, as a unit officer, I felt like I handled my unit well. I never had to call the lieutenant's office, rarely had to hit the body alarm or anything. Just handle my business, and it was the old adage, management through walking and talking. And I've always felt that was the best tool that an institution had, the staff at an institution had, to keep your fingers on it, to keep your hands wrapped around the institution. Not that, the 30 staff or that are on the evening watch or the 100 staff that are there on the day watch are gonna quail a 1,200 inmate riot or whatever, but you gotta be there and be able to see what's going on before it gets going. If you don't have your finger on the pulse, then you're going to get caught with your pants down, just it is. But going back to this New York thing, wow, they, I don't know what they got going on there, but I would love to just go through there and see how they do a normal day. I would, I mean, I've been researching this stuff and it's amazing that they don't have more going on there, if that's the way they operate. Yeah. You go back to, and I'll wrap it up here real quick, but we always used to, back in the early days of training for the Bureau of Prisons, they would revisit the Santa Fe riots, Attica, Walla Walla, Deer Lodge, Montana, all these ones, and see where these failures went to, where they lost control of institutions, staff were hurt or killed, inmates were hurt or killed. Santa Fe probably the most, absolutely crazy riot, and see what they did wrong. And I feel like the Bureau lost that as years went on. They watered down their training. It got to be more, you just do this online course and you braze through it, and you got a half-hour credit for something, and you lost it. The training wasn't there. And revisiting those things where things went wrong in different systems and see how you kept that in mind. And I think those are very useful tools to keep you from making the same mistakes over and over again and seeing how things went wrong. Santa Fe, staff were issuing wholesale beatdowns on inmates. And the next thing you know, the inmates got tired of it. They're laying hands on staff because staff are laying their hands on them. They're thinking, I'm going to get a shot in because I know they're going to get shots on me. And the next thing you know, you lose institutions, staff get killed, inmates get killed, and you got to have the, National Guard come in and take your joint back, So.
That was a conversation I was having with somebody at one time. We were talking about if everybody's doing their role, for lack of a better way of putting it. if start at the top, if the top person's making their rounds, they're talking to the inmates, they're reading their grievances, they know what's happening, they know what the inmates are complaining about, they're looking at the disciplinary process. I think it was Chris or someone mentioned, here's this facility, or there's facilities out there where the inmates don't respect the staff. They're doing whatever they want. They're constantly challenging all that stuff. And what I have found, if you go in, you find out they have a very lackadaisical disciplinary system for how the inmates behave. But so if they're doing those things and they're holding their meetings and they're keeping their thumb on the pulse of what's happening, they should have, hopefully, either the experience to make decisions to get things back on track, or they can reach out to their mentors or their leadership to say, "Hey, here's what I'm seeing here at this facility. How do I get there?" And I don't know. I always worry when I go into a facility, and it has happened to me recently where I'm at a facility and the staff are engaged in a cell extraction, right? Well, I'm looking at the cast of people here. If you were the person over the security department and there's a cell extraction going on, you're going to be there. You're not going to be on the camera. You're not going to be at the door, but you're going to be back watching and monitoring and checking everything out and making sure everything's going the way they should go. And I think a lot of times in corrections, that personal touch is lost. Kind of like what you're talking about, Rick. You're in there walking and talking, getting to know the inmates. You get a feel for their behavior, a feel for the vibe, so to speak, of the facility. And I really think that makes the big difference versus the shift supervisor says, "Oh, those guys can handle it." No, they can't. No, they can't. And I think that leads to a whole lot of other problems, that what you're talking about, systemic throughout probably that entire agency, if not just that one facility. Well, then you take a look at it like Chris, you're talking about. You looked at an incident that took place at one facility, 3 months later, it's happening at another. And just like you guys said, it all happened at the same place.
I'm sorry,
go ahead, Coach.
Go ahead. No, finish. I'm sorry.
No, I had a technical issue over here, so I missed almost all of the conversation. So I'll edit this part out.
That video and that incident there, it's just like, you see you yourselves in the time that you are in the field, you see so many good things. And you think everything, you're making headway, your facility alone, you're making things better, you're making changes. And then something like this comes out and they want to make it all across the board. Every facility is like this, and that's not true. And right. I always go back to my mind as when I see things like that, I jump right back into the officer role or the sergeant role. Okay, I want to see more of that video. I want to see what's more available to make my own judgment, because first of all, that was just unacceptable. I mean, I don't care what happened before that one. That was just uncalled for. That should have never happened. That was so below board. I don't even know how to describe that, but that was leadership fail, from the top on down, just like you gentlemen were talking about. And that's unacceptable. But and you say, did it change anything? Has it changed anything? That's what I'm looking at now, because now I want to research this a little farther and see if they did make any changes to that. Yeah. But that's I mean, you look at that and you look at that as in the correctional field and think, my Lord, how could that ever have got to that point? And to have the quality of people where you see all the rank, there's high ranking individuals in there, and you let that just keep going and going. Even as a human being, I don't know how you could have just not, any one of them stepped in at any given time and stopped that. Mm-hmm. I've been into kind of a situation like that where guys have, something happens between the inmate and staff and they kind of take it personally. They're starting to go overboard. I never once would have stood there, and I haven't. I always had stopped or said something. I think that's just human nature, but that's something there that I can't even wrap my head around that one.
The bizarre part of the whole thing is, I'm not trying to say the wrong thing, but everybody's wearing these body cams. It's all on video.
Absolutely.
This is not, the 80s where there was no cameras anywhere. This is all on video. You find it so blasé that you're, like maybe it's become normal.
Yeah.
And not that I'm advocating for people hiding anything, but when your stuff is on a camera, that's supposed to keep you honest, and it's supposed to keep the inmate honest.
Right. And what were they thinking when they were doing that? You
Right.
know in the back of your mind that camera's on. How do you I just can't see myself getting to that point in rage or into a situation like that where I just totally lose mind control.
Yeah.
Because where was your thinking going there? It
Well, it
definitely
didn't look
wasn't
like a
thinking.
frantic beat, and it looked like a calculated, like
Oh,
over time, just a like a whole
see,
wholesale beat down, you know?
and my snap right off the rip on that video was that was just a violent institution. That was acceptable.
Yeah.
I mean, how else could you sit and look at that and rationalize that? That's a norm. It's that
No.
that would
Yeah.
be my first. If they asked me, I would say this is what you do on a daily basis here.
And
So
like Pete and I were talking, that just didn't happen overnight.
No.
That's a normal, kind of a normal thing there.
Yep.
And and like I said, I shouldn't be saying that. It's because we're not there and we're not dealing with what they're dealing with. But there's been, that's a long-term problem, and there's no quick fix to that one, you know.
I think that agency definitely needs to take a look at bringing some outside people in. Like what you talked about, Chris, ramping up that training thing, communication with staff. There's going to be, I mean, you can expect the courts are going to be holding those people accountable for what they did. But then the facility itself has got to get the message out that this is no longer tolerated. And we have to be the ones, like you said, we have to be the ones who speak up. We have to be the ones who, if I have to jump on the body, if I have to jump in between, if I have to tackle the officer, if I have to do something like that to protect. Because, the thing about it is all of those leaders in there failed those junior staff. Because those junior staff are wanting to have a career so they can provide for their families and do those types of things. And now a good chunk of them are probably headed to jail.
Yeah.
You agree?
And I would think
more, they're going to find more, you know.
And I would think that also is an individual basis of each person that was involved with that incident. If you looked at those people, I would say a lot of them are a little aggressive, regardless of what the situation. Like you could go into a situation and you know how to handle yourself and you know where to stop. But some people don't know where to stop and go just a little steps beyond where you should. But there's somebody that should bring you back. But as an officer that has been trained and kind of shown the way, there's certain instances where you just have to be your own person and deal with that situation at that point in time. But like I said, they just kept going. It just kept escalating and escalating.
Mentality. It became a mentality. Chris, you got anything on that?
Well, I can say one thing is the individuals involved in that incident, they don't represent us. I can say that, most of the staff do great work every single day. And this will take time to build public confidence again. But the staff that are in there in the trenches, they're going to continue doing their duties with honor and compassion and professionalism. I like to say that's the 1% that acts up like that, and 99% do the right thing. But that 1% really taints that 99%.
Mm-hmm.
I tell you, I couldn't believe how if you drove up to the prisons that I was at, they obviously were built very recently. And you bring in, like, whether they're state legislators or whoever's going to come to her, and they're expecting to walk in and see Shawshank Redemption happening, or Brubaker or something like that, or the Green Mile. They have, even though the outside of the building was obviously coming from the 90s, they're still thinking we're back in the 30s and 20s. And these types of incidents that get highlighted on the news and highlighted on YouTube and they go out everywhere, they only reinforce those negative ideas of corrections and correctional staff. And you're absolutely right. And that is the hardest part of all of this is 99% of the staff are hardworking people who are trying to make a living for their family, to put their kids through school, food on the table, and all those types of things. And then this happens. So,
I always go back to, and all through my career, I went back to, and I'd say, what if I'd have started somewhere that had bad people, not the inmates, but bad leaders, because I always go back to, I feel like I cut my teeth on one of the best places, a lot of action, people didn't get worked up over the small stuff, and they handled business, and they handled it the right way. And you got to look at this situation there. And what if you're a new CO? Just, man, you're glad you got. I know I got a job and I'm getting paid every 2 weeks. Holy cow! I was just I was there. I would do anything to keep that job. Go to a job like that, and that's the environment you learn in. That's, you're tainted. You know what I mean? And so there's that factor too. You don't know any different. These guys are saying, yeah, this is what the book said, and this is how we handle business here.
Right.
Yeah. So
that's one thing I did learn early was you learn one way when you first go into corrections and you're taught, and then your leadership changes, warden, assistant warden, and you could see how the facility changes one way or the other.
Yep.
And I've been very fortunate. I've had great leaders, but my whole change was when I went from the prison to the county jail. You talk about a different environment. It was just overwhelming how much different it was. But but like I said, that leadership makes that up and down motion in the facility. And boy, when you're up top and everything's going good, your segregation is empty. You could just tell by the way people act and the way people come into the facility. You could tell the environment is good. But boy, when it goes the other direction, it really shows. And it shows in the staff too, and the way things are handled and situations day by day.
Yep.
But
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yep.
Do you guys mind? Because you guys I'm lucky I know you guys. I really am. And I'm lucky that after all these years, we're still even talking to each other. We've all had lives and we've all done things and we've all, So what I'd like to do is just start my sequence. I see on camera goes Rick, Charlie, Nick, Chris. If you don't mind, just a real quick thing about, whether it was a leader, an incident, a moment, a person, whatever, in corrections that impacted you, that took you in a different frame of mind or moved you on throughout the rest of your career. And I'm going to start. If you guys don't mind, I'll end with mine. Rick, you up to it?
Yeah. I always go back to, when I went to Sheridan, that was my third institution. And I'd seen some good leaders and some bad leaders, and I was kind of formulating the difference between the two, And I was went over there, lateraled as a 11 lieutenant, and the warden there he'd been running things for 20 some years, and as I got to know him and see his leadership, you go lay down, buddy, go lay down. My dog trying to get on my lap. He was amazing in that all the way around. He was the most well-rounded leader I ever met up to that point and afterwards. And I always wanted to try to emulate him because he could hear a situation, get a briefing on it, and would capture the essence of it perfectly and come up with the most amazing answers, how to handle it. And it was he kept it simple, stupid every time and direct, and you knew where he was coming from. There was no bullshitting around. The guy was just an amazing leader. And like I said, I never hit that. I never got to his level in any way, shape, or form, but I wanted to emulate that. And he was one of those leaders that you didn't want to disappoint him. It wasn't so bad to get an ass chewing from him, but you wanted to just stab yourself for disappointing them. You know what I mean? And I always said that's the kind of leader that everybody should emulate.
Yep. How about you, Charlie?
All right, you're gonna be mad at me, Pete. I had two incidents that defined me, and it really made me think about where I was going and how I wanted to present myself in that career. And one was my one captain, Jeff Dragovich, he's passed away since. And the other one was Pete Bloodworth. We've been in a few scrapes. We had a few altercations. We have great talks. And he's taught me to represent that facility like it was mine, take ownership of what I've done, and follow policy, which I was reluctant to do at the very beginning, but just the course that he took with me and more or less kind of took me under their wing and would call me into the office, and we would sit down and we would talk, or he would review cameras with me, or we'd read incident reports. That to me is somebody that cares about you, that thinks about you, and that wants to see you succeed. So they were like molding me.
Well, that's also bookend this, because Charlie had a very short, so he wasn't exposed to a lot of people, so he was stuck with my influence. So how about you, Nick? I know we talked about it, Nick, a little while ago.
You cut me off there. That's it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know I cut you off.
That's what I said. They just define me of really, and that's why I think I excelled like I did. And like I said, I got to do the things that most people at my age or early in my career never got to see until later, farther down in their career. I was really fortunate that I met them too, among others, but those are the two that really impacted me and really sent me on the path that I was on. Like I said, to find me on who I was as a correctional officer. So thank you.
Thank you, man. How about you, Nick?
I'm going to go with, I got quite a few, but I think one of the really big ones that influenced me was Sarah Revel. Revel, I guess, is how she pronounces her name nowadays. It seems like it's changed, but Sarah Revel, she retired regional director, North Central region. But when I was at Greenville, Illinois, as an officer, she was, and I was acting lieutenant to be a lieutenant there. She rolled in as a new warden. And I remember one of the first experiences, I have a tactical background. So she sat by me in the command center during a mock exercise. And during that exercise, she asked me, hey, Nick, what's white Alpha 1? And I said, okay, white is the front of the building. Alpha 1 is the first opening on the lower level. So obviously she didn't have a tactical knowledge of this stuff, but yet she was willing to ask me the questions. So she wanted to learn this stuff. So that really intrigued me that, she would stoop to my level for the information, you know what I mean? And not say anything and act like she already knew the answer to the questions. And then another experience I had with her was we had a Correctional Workers Week picnic, and her and the administration staff did all the cooking and preparation. She worked the grill, she cooked the burgers and the hot dogs. And I mean, they served the officers, and I mean, they worked, and it was hot and they were sweating. And I was like, look at this. This is definitely how you lead by example. She definitely earned my respect that day. And then later on, she came to me when I was a lead disturbance control instructor, and she said, Nick, I want you to do ART, annual refresher training, different this year. And I said, how do you want me to do it different? She says, we're not going to do it spread out through weeks. And I said, okay, how are we going to do it? She says, you're going to do the entire institution in 2 days. And I was like, oh no, that's a disaster waiting to happen. How do I do that? She said, I have faith in you, Nick. You'll figure it out. I know you can do it. We're going to split the institution in 2 days. We'll go holiday schedule. You do half one day, then you do the other half another day. And I was like, oh, this is going to be a disaster, but she wants me to do this, and I'm going to do it right. And it turned out to be the best annual refresher trainings I ever had. And from then on, we always did it that way. It was a great idea. She knew more about me than I did in myself to put me in that position to make me excel. And I really learned a lot from her. And so, yeah, I definitely learned a lot from Sarah Revel.
That's awesome, man. Chris, how about you?
Well, this staff member saw something in me and inspired me to transfer and promote and accept positions of higher responsibility. He actually pushed me to apply to open positions. He introduced me to influential staff, encouraged me that I had the skill set to be successful. After a little gentle persuasion, I went from a GS-11 lieutenant at Allenwood, Pennsylvania, to the senior executive service complex warden at a very active complex in Pollock, Louisiana. I contribute my career advancement and my career success uh, to his support and his confidence. This person was my captain, my first line supervisor, and his name was Pete Bloodworth. Sir, this is why you are the host.
Well, I appreciate your kind words, Chris. Mine is someone that I worked for. He's I don't know if he's still active in corrections or not. His name is Ricardo Martinez. Fantastic warden. I remember we were having issues at a facility, and I think what he believed was there was a lack of involvement on the middle managers. So he had a department head meeting, and he brought everybody together, and he let them know that our job as administrators is to make sure that the officer at midnight has the tools and resources necessary to make decisions and get their job done. And if they don't, then we have failed. And that really resonated with me quite a bit. So I tried to take that everywhere I went. And sometimes, you have that mid-level manager that always seems to be leaving at after 7 hours and 25 or 30 minutes. They never seem to make the whole 8 hours. They never seem to be able to tie a whole pay period together without having a day off. When they would come to me and say, "Hey, boss, do you mind if I leave?" And I'd ask them, "I don't know. Does the officer at midnight have everything they need from you to do their job and the tools and resources to do their job tonight?" Well, how am I supposed to know that? Well, maybe you need to come in at midnight and ask those officers what they need from you. So, that meant a lot to me. And Ricardo Martinez was one of those leaders that always stood out. So I want to thank everybody for being here today and all the conversation. I think it's been great. I think we've really been able to highlight, what we saw in that incident, where we think they could go, some of the problems, and how they could stop those from happening again. So I want to thank everybody for being here, and we'll see you next time.
you.